This morning we're continuing in our series Lost Luggage, looking at another bag that sometimes we're tempted to carry along with us and it weighs us down. Another one that when you look at our lives, it might be, we know that it weighs us down, but why is it that sometimes we just continue to carry these things through life? Well, anyone a fan of superheroes here this morning? Yeah, I was a big fan of superheroes growing up. Still a big fan of superheroes today. I just love the superhero stories and just the character and all the different dynamics. And man, those superhero movies now are just like incredible. I look back at the movies I was watching as a kid like, oh my goodness, like they've just come so far. But I always love the superhero stories. I love the origin stories, right? Like every hero has their origin story of how they came to become a superhero, how they got their powers, whether it was, getting bit by a radioactive spider or building some sort of super suit or some sort of significant life event that changed what they were going through and gave them a new perspective on life. I always loved those stories. And there was this one superhero that I was drawn to as a kid, and he was one of my favorites, and his name was Daredevil. Anyone know Daredevil? Now, Daredevil, the reason I loved Daredevil was because he was so unique. He was so much more different than all the other heroes. Most heroes had this life event where all of a sudden they became super powerful or super strong or could run super fast. But Daredevil's story started when he lost his sight. And then his other senses became heightened. But the reason that I was so drawn to Daredevil was because he was dubbed the man without fear. And I always loved that. The man without fear. Now, Daredevil was an expert martial artist, and he had these heightened senses that kind of gave him his superpowers. But what really made Daredevil powerful was that he was completely fearless. So he was not held back by fear at all. And as a kid, I was so drawn to that because I just remember thinking, I want to be fearless. Like, I wish that fearless was something that described my life. And we've been talking about this luggage that sometimes we carry through life and the things that weigh us down. And this morning, we're going to be talking about fear. Talking about fear and how we can unload the baggage of fear in our lives. Now, over the past couple of weeks, we talked about bitterness. We talked about pride, and I kind of started by trying to help us identify where we see those things popping up in our lives. But a lot of times with fear, you probably don't have a problem with sensing where fear might be popping up in your life. I think fear is usually a pretty easy thing to identify, and it's something that all of us experience in life. We all experience fear from time to time as we're walking through life, or at least you've walked through a season where maybe you were feeling fearful. And we live in this broken world, and we're constantly being thrown and presented with new reasons to fear. So there's, silly fears in life, like maybe snakes or spiders. For some reason, like all women are afraid of frogs, right? Now, there's those sorts of fears, and there's the natural fear, like having a fear of heights. But from time to time in life, sometimes we do encounter some real scary moments. Some moments that really give us reasons to respond in fear. So maybe it's a financial reason in your life that leads you to fear. Maybe you look at a pile of debt, or you look at these bills, and it's like, how am I going to pay these bills, and how am I going to figure this out? Am I going to make enough money? Or what's my future look like with my money? And our finances can bring fear into our lives. Or maybe it's having a fear of change. Maybe you can relate to that, of having a fear of change in your life. Maybe you're at a season where things are comfortable. You're kind of coasting. It's going smooth, but then the thought of maybe change brings in some fear. Maybe it's loneliness. Fear of loneliness is another really big fear. Maybe you fear not having really meaningful friendships. Maybe you're single and worried that you'll never find the one. Or maybe you're married and you struggle with feeling loneliness even within your marriage. Maybe it's fear of failure. We can have a fear of failure, like working hard and coming up short, or maybe being inadequate or not being successful enough. Maybe you have a family member that you're fearful for. You look at that person, you're just like, what's going to happen to them? Will they ever, change? Will they ever go down the right path? And you look at their future just with fear, or maybe it's sickness, or fear of death, or losing a loved one, or maybe you have lost someone you love, and now you fear, how could life ever be the same again? And for me, I know the biggest one that I tend to struggle with is just fear of the future. Right? The unknown. What might be ahead? What maybe is change or this or that or the other, but it's just like we just don't know what's ahead of us, and we have that unknown, and it can lead us to all these questions. And, what's going to happen next? Where are we going to be? Where are we going to end up? How will this work out? How is this going to end up? And we can just get caught up in that fear of the future. Because we live in a broken world, and because of sin, it throws these reasons at us to fear, and we have an enemy that is hard at work and relentless with just throwing those lies at us. And so we are always bombarded with reasons to fear. So this morning I want to talk about how we can lose the luggage of fear and claim the peace and security that Jesus offers us. And I want to talk about two stories in the Bible, and these two stories focus on Jesus and his disciples, and you'll see some similarities between these two stories. Both stories take place with those two groups of people, Jesus and his disciples. Both take place on a boat. Both take place during a violent storm. And in both situations, the disciples come to this place where they can choose to respond in fear or faith. So the first, we're going to pick it up, the story of Jesus calming the storm. It's in Matthew, it's in Mark, it's in Luke, it's in 3 of the 4 Gospels. And we'll pick it up. Seismos in Greek to describe this storm, which actually means earthquake. Which is like, that's kind of weird. Like you're out on a boat in a storm and you say seismos. Well, what's interesting is this word is used 14 times throughout Scripture. 13 times it's actually talking about an earthquake or multiple earthquakes. And this is the one time in Scripture where this word is used to describe a storm or used to describe anything else besides an actual earthquake. So they're out there. It's this seismos storm. And it's almost like you look at Matthew, like the storm was so wild, so violent, like almost as if he's like lost for words to describe this storm. Like it is like an earthquake, earth-shattering type of storm. It was so violent. It was so furious. It was just like an earthquake type storm. And so the disciples are just flooded with fear. I mean, if you've ever been on a boat in a storm, that is a scary, scary thing. You're just like, you're just out there. Where are you going to go? What are you going to do? You can't just go inside. You got to ride this storm out. So they're just flooded with this fear. They're filled with fear, and they're like, this is it. We're going to die. And now, if I'm one of the disciples, I think I might be a little upset. I might sense some bitterness rising in me, right? Like, Jesus, like, I gave up my whole life to follow you, man. Like, I gave up everything, all my possessions, all my stuff. Like, I gave up everything I had to come follow you. And so when you said we were getting on a boat, I thought, like, Royal Caribbean cruise. Like, this is going to be nice. This is turning out to be, like, much more of a Carnival cruise, buddy. Like, what is this? And I think if we're honest, I think a lot of us can find ourselves in the same boat. See what I did there? We find ourselves in the same boat. Well, when we hop on board with Jesus, when we get on board with Jesus, it's almost like we go in and we think like, all right, smooth sailing, right? Like I surrender my life, I give it to Jesus, I'm set, smooth sailing. Like we're just going to have happy marriages and healthy family and wealth and just this nice sunset cruise. But when we look at the Scripture, we don't get those promises. It says that in this world you will face trouble. that these storms will be raging around you. So we don't have the promise that it's just going to be smooth sailing and that nice sunset cruise, but we are promises that Jesus will be with us, that we have a God who is with us, who never leaves us, who never forsakes us, and we're going to hit the rough seas, but he promises to be there right along with us. So we find the disciples, and they're scared out of their minds. They're terrified for their lives. But here's the question, where's Jesus at? Spoiler alert. Jesus was in the stern. Don't you care if we drown? Don't you care about us? Like, do you see what's happening and you're just in here sleeping? They're filled with fear and Jesus is just in there sleeping. And what I love about this story is it's not like they had just met Jesus moments ago and then they got on this boat. They've been walking with Jesus and they've seen him do some pretty incredible things. They've seen him perform miracles. They've seen him drive out demons. They've seen him heal people of leprosy, heal paralyzed people. And they've seen him do these miraculous things, but then they come to this moment where they're questioning him. Like, don't you care if we drown? Like, did you just call us out and do these things and then you're just going to leave us on this boat and let us die? And it's almost like when they were so focused on their fear, it's like just forgot everything of who Jesus was and then what they had seen him do. Just like, do you even care if we drown? I think, if we're honest, I think a lot of times we can have that same reaction in life. When we get caught up in the storm, we can just lose sight of who Jesus is, of the authority that he has, of what we've seen him do in the past, of the promises of his word, and we're just caught up in this storm. And it's like, Jesus, do you see what I'm going through? Do you care that I'm drowning? Like, Jesus, have you fallen asleep on me? Do you even see what's happening down here? So then Jesus gets up and he rebuked the wind and the waves. He says, quiet, be still. And the wind died down. Can you imagine being there for that? Like in the midst of this just wild, crazy storm, and you're thinking, this is it, we're done. Now, if you've ever been in a storm before, you've seen a storm happen, the storm gets wild and violent, and then it kind of simmers down, right? Imagine the moment that Jesus, I imagine he's kind of like groggy as it happens. The Bible doesn't say, I imagine he's kind of like wiping his eyes, like, quiet, be still, I don't know exactly how he did it, but imagine that moment where you're in the midst of this violent, crazy storm, and a man says, quiet, be still, and oh my goodness. Can you imagine that sight? Jesus, quiet, be still. And he turns to the disciples, he said, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? And so this was the disciples' first test with the storm, and clearly they failed, right? They were fear, they were scared out of their minds, they're questioning Jesus, they're doubting Jesus. Well, there's another story that's kind of similar, almost a second chance for these guys. And this story also takes place in 3 out of the 4 Gospels. It happens right after Jesus had fed the 5,000, and so at this point in the story, these guys are further along. They've seen even more crazy, wild things that Jesus has done. They've seen him exercise his authority. I mean, literally telling a storm to stop, and it's just like, all right, cool, and stops. And then here we'll pick up the story in John chapter 6. It says, when evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off the lake for Capernaum. But by now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. Does this sound familiar? When they had rowed 3 or 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. So once again, we see the disciples out on a boat, and they encounter a storm. But one thing I want to point out in there is that it says they were 3 or 3.5 miles out. Like, that is a long way out. They're, rowing their boat gently down the stream when all of a sudden the stream is not so gentle anymore, and they're 3.5 miles out. It's not like, hey, let's just turn around and row back to shore, and we'll take it again tomorrow. We'll try again. I mean, they're in it. They are stuck. They are out there, and they are, I'm sure, exhausted. Like, they've just been rowing this boat 3.5 miles. Well, Matthew gives us even more detail in Matthew 14, verse 25. It says, in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. Now, what does that mean, the fourth watch of the night? Well, the fourth watch of the night is the hours between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So, remember, John told us that when evening came, they went out into this boat. And they're rowing this boat 3.5 miles. And now it's sometime between 3 and 6 a.m. It's the fourth watch of the night. That means they've been in this boat for like 9 hours. 9 hours. They're rowing this boat. They're 3.5 miles out. And then there's this horrible, crazy storm. And then finally, Jesus comes to them walking on the water. It says, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. So they're exhausted. They're thinking they're going to die from this storm, and now it's like, oh, great, now there's a ghost coming to kill us, right? Like, it's so funny. I love this story. I was reading through the New Testament with my boys, and this was just a couple weeks ago. I read this story, and they just started cracking up. Like, they thought I was making it up. Like, I wasn't actually reading the Bible anymore. Sometimes I'll kind of mess with them to see if they're paying attention, and they think they're like, what? No, these are grown men, right? They don't believe in ghosts. Like, either this is wrong or you've been lying to us and ghosts are real. Why did they believe in ghosts? Like, like, what is this? And it's so funny. They're just like cracking up. Like, and I'm like, no, this is really what happened. These guys were so filled with fear. They're so terrified that when they see a man walking on the sea, they're like, oh, that's got to be a ghost, right? Like, one bad thing after another. They see Jesus, this guy that they've been walking with and living with. They've seen perform all of these miracles that you would think, like, Jesus said, I'm going to meet back up with you. You'd think they'd be looking out for him. But no, they're just in this fear and they're just terrified. And then, now here comes a ghost. They're so filled with fear. They're so exhausted that when they see Jesus, they don't even recognize him. They're just so caught up in their fear. They're not looking for Jesus. They're not looking for Jesus to show up. They're just caught up in this storm. And I think that's exactly what fear does. It just puts our focus on the storm around us. Oh my gosh, there's no way out. It is just all around us on every side, and I am just exhausted, and I'm in too deep. I can't turn around. There's no way out. What is going to happen? I think that fear just puts our focus on the storms of life, and it just totally distracts us from the faith that we have in God. And we see it in Scripture that faith and fear are opposites. And when fear comes in, it just drives out faith, right? It just drives out faith. But the good news is that faith drives out fear. So we can have confidence that Jesus is going to show up, right? These guys, it didn't happen exactly like they wanted to and exactly in the timing and how they wanted him to do it. Like, they're 9 hours in, they're 3.5 miles out, they're exhausted, but Jesus showed up. In Matthew 14, verse 27, it says this, but Jesus spoke to them at once. Don't be afraid, he said. Take courage, I am here. Then Peter called to him, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water. Yes, come, Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. Again, put yourself in this story. Imagine that sight. How wild would that be? Like, he's thinking, this is it. We're done for. This storm is going to kill us. We're going to fall in the water. It's just going to capsize our boat. We're going to drown out here. We're going to die. This is it. If that doesn't happen, the ghost is going to get to us. He's just consumed with this fear. And then he sees Jesus, and all of a sudden he's filled with this faith. And Jesus says to him, I'm here. Don't be afraid. Take courage. And you can see that courage just rising up in Peter. And it's almost like the storm around him just disappeared. He's locked in on Jesus. And he says something just so wild. I love that this is Peter comes up with this crazy idea. Lord, if that's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water, and I will. What a crazy thing to say. Like, I think if I saw Jesus, I'd be like, calm the storm. Come on, do it, you know. Like, you see what's going on? Kill it, cut it off, just like last time, you know. But no, it's like the storm's not even there. Jesus, if that's really you, tell me to come to you. I'll walk on the water too. What a wild thing to say. And he just goes from having this fear of we're going to die, we're done for, to I'll get right out of the boat and walk towards you. How crazy is that? See, because his focus was on the storm. He's filled with all these reasons to fear. But then when his focus shifts back to Jesus, this courage rises up in him. And you got to imagine that when he sees Jesus, he's reminded of who he was, of all the miraculous things he's done. He's got to remember that time. Oh, remember that time we were on that boat and we thought we were done for, we thought we were going to die. And Jesus was just like, oh, hey, be quiet, storm. And it stopped. They've seen the authority that Jesus has. They've seen the miraculous things he's done. He's proven the love that he has for them. So he says, man, if that is you, Jesus, you tell me to come on to you walking on the water, and I'll do it. And so what's Jesus say? He says, yes, come. And then Peter takes that step of obedience. With his gaze set on Christ, he steps over the side of the boat and steps out into the water. Can you imagine being one of the other guys in the boat? Just like, oh, he's really going to do it. Like he's really going to do it. Like, we've seen Jesus do miraculous things, but this is just our buddy Peter. He's going to walk on the water too? Kind of crazy, right? And so he gets out and he just starts walking on the water towards Jesus. What an incredible sight. Then in Matthew 14, verse 30, it says, but when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. Save me, Lord, he shouted. So right back again, we see how he's filled with this faith. But he looks away from Jesus, and he looks back towards that storm, and that fear just flushed out the faith, and he sinks. Right? He takes his eyes off of Jesus. He puts his focus back on the storm, and he's just terrified. That fear comes rushing right back in. It says Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. You have so little faith, Jesus said. Why did you doubt me? When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshipped him. You really are the Son of God, they exclaimed. What I love about this story is they thought that the water was going to kill them. They thought that this storm was their end. But the very thing they feared was the thing that Jesus used to build their faith. They were afraid they're going to die in this water, and Jesus used it as an opportunity to show the authority that he had over the water. I just love that. So it's like, hey, you're afraid that this storm's going to kill you? Well, I'm here, so walk on it. Like, what an incredible, just that imagery. I just love that this storm that they were so worried was going to kill them, that it was surely the end. But it gave them an opportunity to depend on Jesus and to trust him. And when Peter was simply focused on Jesus, he felt that. Like, man, nothing is impossible. Jesus is here now. Jesus has the authority. There's nothing to fear. The fear doesn't even make sense anymore because I know what this guy can do. He's so filled with faith that he's willing to step out into the middle of the storm, right? The storm calms later. He steps out into the storm. But as soon as his focus goes back onto the storm, that fear rushes right back in. He stops thinking about who Jesus was and what he was capable of. He just looks back to the storm. He's like, oh man, this doesn't make any sense. This doesn't make any sense. I'm walking on the water. There's this storm. This is clearly going to kill me. Like, this is not logical. This doesn't make any sense. And he sinks. And this is exactly what the enemy wants to do to you. He wants to keep your focus on the storm. He wants you to think that there's no logical way out of the storm that you are in. There's no way. How could you get out of this? It is around you on every side, and you are exhausted, and you're ready to give up. And the enemy just wants to keep our focus on the storm. He just wants to fill us with those lies. There's this one part that I love, and I want to point out to you. Jesus says to him, you have so little faith. You have so little faith. And I want to point that out because if you remember in the last story, what happened? Jesus calmed the storm, and what did he say to them? He said, do you still have no faith? So this is a little bit of progress here, right? It's like, hey, you had no faith, but now this time you had a little faith. And it's kind of like, that's encouraging to hear, right? Look what he was able to do with just that little bit of faith. Just that little bit of faith. He was able to step out of the boat, and he walks on the water. And then he comes back to that doubt, and he sinks, and Jesus has to save him. And in that moment, he's probably like beating himself up, like, oh man, I was walking on the water, and then I looked right back at the storm, and I sunk, and then Jesus had to pull me out of the boat and put me in the water. I'm all wet, and now I got to ride back to shore, right? And it's easy to kind of look at Peter and remember the moment where he doubted him and all these things. But guess what? There was a whole bunch of other guys just sitting in the boat, and I love that he had that boldness to step out in faith. He had that little bit of faith, and what an incredible thing it must have been to be Peter. Can you imagine coming back and being able to tell that story? Be like, yo, craziest thing happened. Jesus was walking on the water, and I was walking on the water too. Like, no way, Jesus did it, but you did it too? Like, and he is the only person with that story. He's the only person that gets to go and tell that story. Because guess what? Everyone wants to walk on water, but no one wants to get out of the boat. Right? Everybody wants to be the guy that's out there walking on the water, but there was a handful of other guys just sitting in the boat. But Peter got to experience the miracle. He got to be a part of this miracle because his faith showed up in his actions. Right? He knew what Jesus was capable of, and then he acts on it. He acts in obedience. Jesus says, come, and he does it. And so it wasn't about what logically made sense. He just had faith, and then he put it into action. He steps out. So a lot of times it's like we want to see the supernatural things show up in our lives, but we're just like those other guys sitting around in the boat, right? I shared earlier that my biggest fear is the unknown, right? Like what might happen. I'm sure a lot of you guys can probably relate to that because we just don't know, right? Like, we just don't know. When we look at the future, we don't know. And I'm the kind of guy that I like to have a plan, right? We're going to have a plan. We're going to execute on the plan. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. If this happens, then we'll do that. Backup plan, plan A, plan B, plan C, right? Like, I like, nothing's going to get me, right? I want to know where we're going, what we're doing, where are we going, what we doing, how long is it going to take to get there? Is there going to be food on the trip? Do we need to eat before? Like, I want to have the plan, right? Okay, thank you. I got an amen there. Like, I want to know what the plan is. I love this. Is it Proverbs 16, verse 9? In his heart, a man plans his course, but the Lord determines his step. And I'm that guy. Like, I'm always trying to, like, hey, Jesus, let's just put together a little conference here, and, like, we'll spitball some ideas. Let's hear what you got. You hear what I got. Like, I'll submit to you, but, like, let's just take it into consideration, And it's like, let's sit down and come up with a good plan. And so when Jesus told me, hey, guys, just go get in the boat, start rowing, I'll meet up with you later, I would have been like, wait, what? Like, where are we going? What are we doing? How long are we going to be out there? Where are you going? What are you doing? When are you going to meet up with us? Is there going to be food on this boat? Like, how, like, what are we supposed to expect here? But I love that Peter just took it one step at a time. Right? He steps out of that boat and he's just walking towards Jesus. He took that step of obedience and just begins walking towards him in faith. And he was fine until he looks back towards the storm and that fear came right back in. So we don't know what the future holds. I don't know what the future holds, but God does. And if he wanted us to know, I'm sure he probably would have filled us in. He probably would have done that. But our faith, it teaches us to depend on him. Right? So there's so many times where I could look back at my life and I'm like, man, if present me could go back and talk to past me would live with so much faith, knowing with how God was going to provide and what God was going to do and all the solutions that he was going to come up with that I just had no idea of. But that's why we got to depend on him. We got to have that faith that I don't know, but he does. And he has proven the love that he has for me, so I can simply trust in him and walk by faith. Take it one step at a time, keeping our eyes set on Jesus. And the storms will rage around us. The enemy wants to cripple us. He wants us to carry that baggage to weigh us down. But let's keep our eyes set on Jesus. When we can let go of the baggage of fear. We can claim the peace and the security that Jesus offers us. And so I don't want to rant and talk for too long. I want to keep it super simple, because the message is simple. Is when our gaze is set on Christ, we understand that there's no reason to fear. But when we're focused on the storms, we sink. And fear is a heavy bag to carry. It can cripple us. It leads us to doubt God. And it robs us of the peace that he offers us. That fear will drive out our faith, but faith drives out fear. So let's keep our eyes set on Jesus. Let's keep our eyes focused on the promises of his word over the unknowns of life. Let's be reminded of who he is, of what he's capable of all the ways that he has proven his love for us. And let's live boldly. Let's walk out in obedience one step at a time, not worrying about what makes sense and how logically is this going to happen. And blah, 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 blah. Let's just step out of the boat and follow Jesus in the midst of the storm, keeping our eyes set on him, knowing that those storms are going to rage around us, but Jesus is with us. Our God is for us. He is with us always. And just as he calls out to his disciples, he calls out to us, take courage. I am here. Do not be afraid. Let me pray for us. Jesus, we love you. And God, I thank you for the opportunity that you give us to have a relationship with you, that you are with us always to the very ends of the age. God, that while we live in this life where we're not promised the sunset cruise into eternity, we live in this broken world where the storms rage around us. God, I thank you that you are with us through it all. So God, I pray that we wouldn't just scream out and say, calm the storm, get rid of it, fix it. Are you sleeping? Do you see what I'm going through? God, we would trust that you are with us every step of the way. That God, while we don't know the future, you do. God, that while we might not be smart enough to come up with solutions and figure it all out on our own, God, we can just simply trust in you. So God, I pray we would take our eyes off the storms, that we would turn our eyes to you, Jesus. God, that we would look to your word, to see the promises that you have for us, to know that you are a man of your word, that you never change and you are with us always. So God, as we walk through these storms, we fix our eyes on you, Jesus. We love you and we thank you